Please take your seats. We know this is a kind of a celebratory occasion, and some of you haven't seen each other for decades, I'm sure, so it's tough to rip you away from your former friends and all, but we'll also have time at dinner and throughout various points in the day tomorrow as well. But we should get to the last question about challenges, and that's indeed what this panel is required to do. Why is there no one sitting next to me? Oh, Charles, come on up. Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Well, somehow reflections didn't require too many images, but challenges do. So a number of the panelists will then step from here, as Charles read is, and go up there and use some of this material back behind me. So let me just quickly introduce the panel in alphabetical order. Susan Feinstein, a professor of planning here, by no question one of the most eminent public policy and planning scholars in the field. And please all kind of go get her new book called The Just City. Yes. It just came out. Rodolfo Machado, a long-standing member, of course, of the faculty, chair of the Department of Urban Planning in design until 2 years ago, partners with Jorge Silvetti and the very eminent architecture and urban design firm, Machado Silvetti, and sadly, at least for us, if not for Rodolfo, Rodolfo just retired from the faculty 6 months ago. Michael Pride, who is also not here. Oh, well, can you stand up at least or something, Michael? Michael Pride, associate professor at the University of Cincinnati, served as the director of the School of Architecture there for about 7 years, I think, until 2009. A member of the City Planning Council, City Planning Commission there, as well as many other civic organizations. And until Ron took over, president of the Alumni Council of the Graduate School of Design for a number of years. So welcome, Michael. Charles Waldheim, the John E. Irving Professor and Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture, the acknowledged coiner, that's probably a more elegant word, coiner of the term landscape urbanism, and author of many, many publications, including, of course, the Landscape Urbanism Reader. And where, I guess Marion's down there. I guess the image people are sitting down there, right? Marion Weiss, the Graham Professor of Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, co-founder of Weiss Manfredi, Architecture, Landscape, Urbanism. Now that's architecture / landscape / urbanism, not landscape urbanism. But you can, and among many, many remarkable projects and awards, in fact, the Harvard University Graduate School of Design awarded Marion and her partner the 2008 Green Prize for a really remarkable project, the Olympic Park in Seattle. This is the challenges panel. I'm not sure what challenges people will raise. I'd like to kind of just, raise 2 or 3 in the hopes that those might be picked up because they seem important to me. Obviously, without any argument, worldwide urbanization is taking place at a remarkable rate, unprecedented across the globe. We are an urban species. There's no doubt about that anymore. Whether or not we're preparing ourselves properly in any of the design disciplines or planning disciplines for this, I'm not sure, but it certainly is a challenge to deal with the rate of urbanization that's been taking place for the past 20 or 30 years, indeed actually since the Industrial Revolution, but seems to be accelerating in some parts of the world. The claims on urban design are certainly growing. The claims from landscape architecture are growing substantially. The claims on urban design from planning are growing substantially, as we talked a bit about in the last panel. And so how urban design as a field or as a discipline or as a frame of mind responds to those claims, I think is very important to those of us who call ourselves urban designers, for sure. The challenge of sort of participatory democracy is certainly a continuing challenge across North America for sure, but without too much longer in other parts of the world as well. It's already happening. The kind of the dilemma of responding to stakeholders versus sort of more broad social agendas, a very, very important challenge, again, in all of our fields, certainly in those that call ourselves urban designers. And perhaps at least lastly, from my standpoint, again, I'm not asking you to speak about those challenges. I'm eager to hear yours. The sort of dialectical condition that I think is central to urban design, frankly, between the kind of the championing of things already there, preserving, improving, respecting, contributing to those things that are really there, as opposed to, of course, being agents of the new. I think that's a very, very important challenge of people, anyone who calls themselves urbanists, but certainly those that are involved in the urban design discipline. So those are sort of some of my challenges that I throw out at this distinguished panel, but without further ado, Charles Waldheim.
Thanks very much, Alex. Good afternoon. Some of my best friends are urban designers, and it's a really happy occasion to be here, 50 years. I thought in the 5 minutes that I've been asked to make a few comments about the challenges facing urban design going forward, I might say something by way of a kind of transition from the previous panel, which I thought was quite compelling, the storylines that emerged. Inasmuch as my own work occasionally deals with historical material, and the history and origins of urban design have figured quite prominently in my own thinking over the last several years about the questions of the contemporary city. I guess I would also say it's fair to characterize my remarks in the context of being a challenger. I'm here reprising, maybe as many of us are, my kind of traditional role vis-a-vis the Department of Urban Planning and Design and the program in urban design, which is as a kind of loyal opposition, a kind of friendly visitor who would come in occasionally and poke and prod a little bit. And in that respect, I suppose it might be fair also to talk about briefly what's going on in the context of the Department of Landscape Architecture. I was just reflecting in talking with several colleagues who have come back for the event on an event just over 10 years ago, 1999, a conference at Washington University titled Landscape, Democracy, and American Urbanism. Not because it was necessarily the most important event in the history of conferences on urban design, but it was a moment at which both I and a number of my colleagues continued a conversation about this emergent category of landscape urbanism. It was also an event in St. Louis that I almost didn't reach. I woke up that morning that I was to appear in St. Louis in Chicago. I wasn't feeling very well. My flight from O'Hare got delayed, and it was one of those events that almost didn't happen, but I'm very happy in retrospect that it did. I arrived in St. Louis and went to dinner at which I was introduced to three people, all of whom coming from urban design and UPD here at the GSD, went on to then introduce me to the institution. So it was only through that plane that I made finally to St. Louis that I was introduced here. So Peter Rowe, Hashim Sarkis, and Richard Sommer each gave papers at that conference and in various ways touched on the ways in which urban design was evolving at the end of the 20th century. 5 years after that, after a series of invitations to join Urban Design Elements reviews here, kind of watching the perennial sparring about the future and history of that pedagogy, Alex Krieger invited me very kindly to offer an option studio as a visitor here between urban design, landscape architecture. And then 5 years later, in 2009, last year, I finally joined the faculty. And so in that respect, I'm very pleased to be here. As my family and I were reflecting on the choice to come here a year and a half, 2 years ago, among the things that were kind of present for us was the great history of this place in questions of the contemporary city. And I personally came to the conclusion that there was no better venue in the English language in the world for the development of my own project and my own work, my own maturation and articulation of my thoughts, in large part given the presence of the history of the program in urban design and colleagues in the Department of Urban Planning and Design, and I continue to benefit enormously from their proximity. In the Department of Landscape Architecture, of course, we are at a particular moment in time that's been alluded to over the last couple of hours at a couple of moments. I think, not the first person to describe it as the oldest and most distinguished department of its kind in the world. And in a way, I think it's also no secret to you that we have our own little internal narrative that suggests that the origins of landscape architecture in the United States, the kind of foundational myth of landscape here at Harvard between the president's office, the Department of Landscape Architecture, and the formation of the profession, has also served as a kind of historical conscience, a kind of repository of social and environmental values. At various moments, that narrative would suggest that set of beliefs and values wells up to a point that actually exceeds landscape architecture's grasp, and at various notable moments, many of which have already been alluded to, spins off a whole new discourse or a whole new department. In fact, the origins of city and regional planning in the 1920s, and of course, a moment that I'll return to in just a second, in the 1950s, the conferences and foundation of the program in urban design here. And so, in some ways, for my colleagues in the Department of Landscape Architecture, we have a narrative in which questions of urbanism have always been at the core, at the foundational heart of our discipline. And equally today, I think we find ourselves at a moment of renewed consciousness relative to those conditions. There's an interesting sidebar detour that in another moment we might actually pursue, which is what happens within landscape architecture in the moments after that spin-off of a new discipline and a new discourse. I think that landscape architecture in the United States in particular, and here in this department, has benefited enormously from its engagement with urban discourse across the university and across the design school. Having said that, there is always this kind of historical shadow cast as it kind of recoils from its historic engagements in urbanism. But I'm very happy to say that I'm here in a very particular role at a very precise moment of time during which we're renewing our engagement with the city. In addition to our historic strengths in the practice of landscape architecture and in ecology and technology, we're at a moment renewing our commitments to the history and theories of landscape architecture. We're renewing our commitments to landscape representation, digital media, and equally we're renewing our commitment to conversations of the contemporary city. In that regard, I was very pleased last year, as Alex was serving as chair in UPD, that we agreed, among other things, that we would begin to admit candidates into the Master of Landscape Architecture and Urban Design degree stream, a degree stream that I was really happily surprised to see consistently generated dozens and dozens of applicants annually, yet I could rarely find anyone who had actually been admitted to the program. That decision is, I think, one indication of a range of other decisions that are ongoing. I would also equally argue that from landscape's perspective here within the GSD, we've benefited already enormously from the appointment of Raul Mehrotra. As a member of the search committee that identified Mehrotra, and now as his colleague, I can just tell you personally how thrilled I am to see his leadership taking over both the program in urban design, but also the department chair of UPD. And already our discussions have ranged across a range of topics that I think will begin to bear fruit very, very shortly. So, Raul, we're very glad that you're here. In 2009, that year that I joined the faculty here, there was the publication of Urban Design, this anthology that Alex and Bill Saunders co-edited, which was itself a spin-off from a series of Harvard Design Magazine editions that had come from the 2006 conference, which was itself the 50th year anniversary of the first conference in urban design here at Harvard. I was very pleased to be invited in that context to be a kind of productive challenger for a kind of friendly opponent from the outside, and began to kind of question in a short piece called The Other 1956, what might have been the history and future of urban design here had Joseph Hudnut in 1936 in fact secured a deal with Mies van der Rohe. Of course you know this story that in fact Hudnut approached Mies before approaching Gropius, and it was the fact that Mies refused to stand as a candidate among a short list of other candidates that in that version of the tale led in fact to the appointment of Gropius. That's a moment that I'll return to in a minute. But rather than referring to my own essay, what I want to refer to briefly is a piece by Richard Marshall and pick up a little bit on some of Richard's comments from the previous panel. In his piece, I'll note as a kind of subtext, of course, Richard's piece is at the front of the book and my general opposition is at the back. Richard's piece was called Elusiveness of Urban Design, Perpetual Problems of Definition and Role, and I think he alluded to some of that content in the previous panel. Among other things, Richard's research turned up the interesting fact I've already alluded to, that in fact among the original conversations in 56, 57, the idea that urban design might have in fact been lodged in the Department of Landscape architecture as one conceivably logical home. Now, even though that did not come to pass, ultimately, Richard's research went on, I think, in an interesting way to shed light on what I think of as really the central challenge to urban design going forward. Now, Alex has already alluded to several challenges and in a way done the work for us, but of course, my own interest in Ludwig Hilbersheimer, the city planner, and his potential role in a GSD with Mies is of course something that I muse on in my essay in the book. Among other things, what I find compelling about Hilb's work is the idea that the challenges of mobility, challenges of contemporary economy, and challenges of ecology are addressed very directly as early as the 1950s, and in fact the integration of landscape ecological principles into planning practice. Ultimately, those challenges of mobility, economy, and ecology are with us to this very day, and in fact, rather than suggesting that there are these new challenges, I think the challenges ahead of us are very much like those challenges from the 1950s, but in different terms. In his essay, Marshall finds quite a distinct break between the earliest conferences of urban design, the April 1956 and April 1957, first and second conferences of urban design, he argues and he finds were embedded in a discourse that we've already heard this afternoon, in which landscape architecture was central to the project. In his essay, Marshall finds that in fact the third conference, April of 1959, represents a significant break. Simultaneous with a diminution of landscape's role, there was at the same moment the kind of mobilization or operability of the program, and at the same moment the ascendance of architecture as the dominant metaphor that would come to define urban design. I'll just cite briefly a passage that I think sums up the thesis I'm trying to get at here. This is again Richard Marshall. By the third Urban Design Conference in April 1959, the terms of urban design seem to have been sufficiently developed so that the first case study projects were documented. What is interesting is that there does not seem to be any conclusions or set of principles from this conference ever published, and the criteria for choosing the case studies are not explained in any of the conference materials. Interestingly, Marshall finds the architectural focus of the discussions reinforces a further separation from planning. But what is also evident in the subject matter and the people attending is the diminution of landscape architecture's influence as well as centrality. Landscape was not discussed at all in these case studies. This obvious lack marks a fundamental shift from the previous two conferences and would set the tone for all subsequent conferences. The common ground in which architecture, landscape architecture, and planning would come together to deal with the problem of urbanism quickly gave way in April 1959 to a narrower architectural conception of urban design's role in the world. This was, of course, following two conferences in 56 and 57, in which the presence and role of Ekbo and Sasaki et al. Was in fact a part of the intellectual stimulation of the event. Ultimately, Marshall describes in Sert's own thinking a distinction between the first two conferences and the third, in which the first two conferences Sert refers to as ultimately resulting in a, quote, fog of amiable generalities. And then ultimately the third conference represents for Sert presumably a kind of a more complete description of the urban design project. I think it's not coincidental that that focus on a singular professional metaphor or disciplinary metaphor through which to proceed in urban design coincides almost precisely with the formation of an academic program. In that regard, I think that the fundamental challenge confronting urban design going forward, in addition to, of course, mobility, economy, and ecology, has to do with the struggle between the institutionalization of the discourse of urban design and the need that we address challenges which exceed or transcend its boundaries. In the original formulation between 1954, when the first course was offered, including coursework by Hideo Sasaki, and 1956 at the first conference, there was a heady moment at which the challenges of urbanization were the subject matter and the disciplinary frameworks were still in formation. That moment is something I think we have to return to historically to rewrite for our present context. It was at the moment of the institutionalization of the discourse, if not the professionalization in a nascent way of urban design, that in fact the relationship to ecology, the relationship to landscape fell away, as well as many other aspects of the project that did fall away. I think many of us in the building feel today that the real challenges of urban environments transcend disciplinary and professional boundaries, and that ultimately to regain its voice, I think urban design would probably want to seek out again that kind of foggy interstitial space within which the challenges exceed the discourse of urban design. Thank you.
Professor Feinstein.
Okay, I have, I think the lights have to go down, yes? Well, I noticed to my dismay when I opened the program that Harvard always likes to put when you got your degree down next to your name. And so it notes that my bachelor's degree was acquired in 1960, a date that I don't always bruit about here. But at any rate, it did bring me back to what was the state of urban design at that time, and that was, of course, the date of the birth of the urban design program here in the GSD, a fact of which I was totally unaware, in fact, as an undergraduate. What I was aware of, however, was what was going on in Boston in terms of urban renewal, that this was the period when the paradigmatic case of the brutality of urban renewal, that is the destruction of Boston's West End, occurred. It was also somewhat before, or maybe at the same time, I'm not sure, of the Save the Sycamores, which was to protect Memorial Drive from a highway. And it was the beginnings of the development of Government Center in Boston. So urban design was really entangled at that time with displacement of heedlessness of low-income people, and of the concept, really, of the master builder. Now, 50 years later, there's the orthodoxy, I guess I would say, of urban design has changed dramatically. Nobody so far has mentioned Jane Jacobs, which somewhat surprises me, but her influence, of course, was huge, so that now, rather than the idea of the master builder, the master plan, there's a much greater emphasis on rehabilitation, on mixed uses, on a landscape that, or an urbanism that reflects people's collective memory and not just the idea of something new and that something new would be better. However, this current emphasis, which is certainly, I think, appealing and not inappropriate, but it oddly has not only the same effect in many respects as urban renewal, but perhaps reinforces or is much more successful in achieving what the urban renewers sought to achieve, which was basically bring the middle class back, get the poor to the periphery, make the city that is urbane, that's lively, that the upper class and the professional class wants to be in, but that it turns out that this new city, which is for people, I think, like all of us in this room, more appealing, may not offer any more for the people who are low-income people, the people of color, than did the city that was being destroyed in the 1950s and 60s. In my book, to which Alex kindly made reference, The Just City, I try to establish three principles as those which should guide urban planning and design. Those principles are equity, democracy, and diversity. I think that design is very sensitive, actually, now to issues of diversity, to some degree, perhaps, to democracy, but that equity or justice is not really foundational to the activities of designers, which in part is certainly not their fault, but is a product of the political situation in which they find themselves. I'm going to very briefly outline a case study that's one of the cases in my book, which to me exemplifies some of the issues currently in urban design. So this is the new Yankee Stadium. It's nostalgic. It looks sort of like the old Yankee Stadium. The difference is that it's got inside it many of the amenities that people currently sought outside it, but that makes it much more profitable for the New York Yankees, which were already the richest team in baseball with the largest media market. Now, people I know who go to Yankee games just love it. They love the sight lines, they love the way it looks, they love being in it. So it's a success in design terms, actually. But what it did was, besides the fact that the public sector has put over $1 billion into this enterprise for a profit-making firm, that it displaced the largest park in that part of the Bronx. Supposedly this park is going to be replaced with 2 other parks, but that won't be for a couple of years yet. That the local community board opposed the building of the stadium, and its reward was that the Bronx Borough president fired all the members of the community board who had voted no. So it represents to me the kind of injustice that can be ignored, even though one has perhaps a triumph of design. My good example, although it's now in abeyance as a consequence of financing issues, as almost all mega projects currently are, is the Zuidas outside of Amsterdam, which is a large mixed-use project, but which is attempting to take a business district and humanize it, which will involve a great deal of affordable housing and public spaces of various kinds. So my conclusion then really is that in relationship to the broad issue of urban planning and design, the values of equity, diversity, and democracy are problematic in that they may indeed pull in different directions, and that particularly producing a diverse, exciting urban landscape may indeed undermine some of those other principles. Nevertheless, even though I can't stand here and say what is the right policy in any particular context, that equity should in fact receive priority when we're talking about planning cities, and that we have to be conscious as planners and designers of the equity issues always involved. Thank you.
Rodolfo?
I don't have a slides.
So
From there?
wherever you'll feel comfortable, yes. Right.
Okay. It's probably over there. Do I need this? No. Do I need this?
You do.
Not if you're there, you know.
Hello, everybody. It's good to see you back. Many faces that I still recognize. And it's good for me to be back, too. I've left some time ago. And exactly, I was here about 18 months ago when I gave a lecture about all about urban design, and I was stepping down from my half of the chair. The other half was Gerald's at that time. And it was like that. In a way, I do not have anything too new to say. I may repeat things I have said when I left. You know, this late in life, one does not change positions easily. So apologies to the ones that heard it, because some things are maybe the same. But the argument is different, and I hope it doesn't get too heavy. After all, this is a celebration, we're told, in spite of the sepulchral black. And it should be entertaining, so I try to do my best in spite of the subject. To construct my argument then about challenges, I need to repeat some of what I said at the time. Essentially, in that talk, I refer to urbanism as a body of knowledge that encompasses 2 disciplines that have to do with the formal design of the city, with the form of the city. And they are physical urban planning at a larger scale and urban design at a much smaller scale. But to see urbanism is the thing that encompasses those 2 things. I'm sure that some of you do not agree with that, but that's the way in which I still see it. Further, at that time, I spoke about urban design's relation of dependency from architecture, not unlike José Luis Sert's view of it, I said emphatically that the urban designer is first an architect, and that needs to remain so, in my opinion, if urban design is to exist. And I repeat that I still see then this diagram where there's urbanism, planning, physical planning and design, and then urban design depending very much in the sense of architecture. About challenges, I would like to call this little talk the challenge within, or the challenge from within, since we already spoke about population and a lot of things that we know. Well, let's look about the challenge at home. And because I think that there are some, and we need to pay attention to. So it means the challenge within the GSD. By challenge, what do we mean? I mean, the challenge is not a foe or an enemy. A challenge is a situation that prompts you to better or improve certain conditions to respond. You may create a duel or a thing of that kind. It could be confrontational, it doesn't need to be. Essentially, it's not an enemy, but it's something that challenges us. Well, that's the tautology. Something that forces us to do something better or in a different way. These challenges are two, and there is one that is smaller than the other, the minor little challenge. And I would say the challenge within, in that sense, is architecture. Is Scott around? I should be very careful. Why am I saying this? Well, because of the intimacy of the relation between architecture and urban design, if something happens in architecture that reflects in urban design, consistently and historically we have been dependent from it. That is to say, when modernism happens in architecture, modern urban design follow, so on and so forth. So, and what is going on there that worries me, or what's going on there that has repercussions for urban design? Well, for instance, just a recent development, or if you wish to call it a recent trend, which for lack of a better name we would call parametricism. And what happens with that technique, or that body of incipient, formative, maybe evolutionary knowledge, is that it is not interested or ignores two things which are fundamental to urban design, which are the notion of culture and the question of essentially of the typology or continuity or of history. So poor little urban design that necessitates a culture, because it represents that comes from a culture, that represents continuity and needs typology and all those things, all of a sudden architecture went in a direction in which is no longer of use to us. Simply because the ethics that underlies parametricism, for instance, is very different from the ethics that underlines urban design, which is by far more, in circumstances, a smaller, exploratory situation. There is less degree of experimentation possible in urban design, and architecture is different. So what happens? All of a sudden, poor urban design have left alone, no longer to go to the party with architecture because she's doing something funny. So, but maybe this is good for us. Maybe that will force an introspective mood in urban design, or maybe a recognition of certain autonomy, that there are some things that maybe should no longer be dependent from architecture, and that we should do our own thing, so to speak. Now, of course, what is that and all that is a subject that cannot be done in 5 minutes, so hold it. As an aside, I should mention that things get really, really crazy and very, very funny when this parametricism stuff contaminates planning. Because, physical planning done according to those things gets into the most truly, really kind of ridiculous conditions. But that's an aside, of which we have seen some examples. The second challenge, which I think is a deeper and more complex, oh my gosh, has to do with who is claiming to be responsible for the form of the city. So I have conveniently packed together in the same bag 3 diverse yet overlapping recent ideological quests or bodies of techniques, and claiming a role in defining the form of the city. So in any order, I have put together ecological urbanism, sustainable urbanism, and landscape urbanism. We know that differences, but for the sake of the argument, they're all back together and hope the kittens will not fight. And this is what is happening, let's say. It's clearly a dominant ideology now. How it became dominant is another story, but it is that way. There has been a lot of pounding, and it has been effective. What happens is that the structural notions for those three modes of doing things, ecology, sustainability, and landscape, have always been present in different degrees in the making of responsible and serious, professional, if you wish, and good urban design. Urban design has never been oblivious to those ideas, but of course sometimes it hasn't treated them very seriously and has done it badly. But it's not that it was not aware of it. It's a question of then, not of the notions, but what is happening to those. Thus, the challenge is not presented by the notions themselves, but by the claims that are made to the role in determining the form of the city based on those notions. I mean, that's, I think, what the challenge is. Urban form, I mean, I repeat, for me, should be determined. It comes from culture, by architecture. It's done by the urban designers in partnership with an array of consultantships that, in general, I mean, I'm stating a very conventional view of the practice, if you wish. Yet, one should remember the following. There has been, in recent years, a remarkable terminological displacement. We have been called differently, and we know that every time that there is a change in the word that is used, there is a change of meaning. But I would say that the terminological displacement is not really a paradigmatic earthquake. It's more like a passing storm. Things have not changed that much in spite of the words. Geography, years ago, we call it site or context or natural context. The ecological was always present in the notion of the vernacular or in the idea of just plain good old common sense, which also impregnates urban design. And the sustainable was present in the understanding of what was then called the spirit of the place. Remember that old notion? Well, the sustainable was somehow going on there. So essentially, this is what has happened. I think that the claims are very large, and I'm not so sure that the final products will sustain the claims. So in closing, I'd like to call this the new holy trinity: ecology, the sustainable, and the landscape. Urbanism challenge the urban designer to be more ethical, more responsible, more just, more aware, more careful, but not to relinquish our role in determining the form of things urban, the form of the city. Urbanity is something we do. So these have been my 2 cents in 5 minutes about the 2 challenges within. Thank you.
So, Marian Weiss, please. I'm talking to this.
Well, I think that was a rousing introduction of several speakers, but perhaps you could say that we're all here, if we've got architectural backgrounds, to assert the assertions of CERT as the origins of urban design. But in any case, I think it's unfair to try to be too confident about to say what the challenges are, because they vary each time. And in my own experience, and in Michael Manfredi, my partner's experience, our kind of hybrid steps between the academy and practice have humbled us at every turn. Because at one moment, the terms become expressive, articulate, powerful, compelling, and then we are brought to our knees when we hit the very real conditions of practice. So it seems that it's a welcome time to be part of this expanded conversation, because urbanism really has this evolving identity. It's a chameleon, and in our minds, it's a hybrid project. And so if it is indeed a hybrid project, one wonders if this project can constitute a distinct identity while linked to various conditions and zones it engages. So in our own preoccupations, because we find ourselves coming upon it at all times in our work, we wonder if infrastructure with its single-use agenda can be leveraged for multiple agendas. It's there, it's big, it's built, and it's free. So we think there's some promise in there. And we think that maybe it can actually take on additional, maybe identities as a local destination as opposed to a bypassing agenda. So if we think about the project of urban infrastructure, be it inhabitable or multifunctional, can it be, in fact, an artifact of urban life? So I will begin, maybe, with a few provocative images and then maybe demonstrate how we're trying to understand it better one project at a time. So this is this, I would say, seductive image for us right now, because when we think about what are the forces that potentially impede the identity of urban life, you could say that infrastructure in all of its force certainly has an impact on urban life, but the more natural forces of nature, and arguably with climate change, flooding, is a new invader, if you will, of our utter confidence as architects and urban designers about what we can do about it. So if we look at this, and then we look at a more topographic question, one can think that maybe cultivation, culture, topographic changes, public life might have some kind of tactical capacity to transcend the administrative boundaries which have been spoken above here so eloquently as maybe more potent forces to leverage. So if we look at, say, other visions of urban design, the kind of totalizing utopias that Hugh Ferris represented better than anybody, actually have something at its root that we find very, very compelling, which is that it is an urban identity that has thickness, density, section, use, efficacy, and a capacity to be more than one thing at all times. So arguably, then, the obligations of infrastructure maybe offer new opportunities to extend, invent, and support new forms of urbanism. And the singular and unique must be resisted. The homogenizing tendencies of the master plan maybe need to be subverted. And maybe we can all be humbled by other realities. When LMDC came into formation, Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, in response to post 9/11, we were invited to actually deal with the trauma around No. 1 Police Plaza with all the on and off ramps of the Brooklyn Bridge. This was not a moment for a master plan, but a moment for tactics. In fact, we actually discovered leftover bits, 7.5 acres of pieces that nobody ever touched that could be part of public life, except for the fact that it was divided in multiple sections. Sections that indeed created barriers. This is two-story New York that never thrived. Police Plaza on the upper level, the rest of the world below. So we thought that indeed, and the mayor actually offered $50 million to make it happen, so it will happen, we believe that a sectional connection could be realized as both public and, in fact, landscape. But nobody seemed to love as much as we did the potential in the spaces between this kind of sublime drama, overlooking the on and off ramps. And in that section, we thought that why not swim with the fishes? So that gets to another question then. I mean, cities actually have many things to deal with at the same time, and natural forces and urban identities actually need to coexist. And when we were invited to look at what the potentials were for naturalizing the lower Donlands in Toronto, one of the things that was striking is that this immense watershed for the entire Toronto area got consolidated to one post-industrial channel, which, as you can imagine, was not the most effective way to manage water in a city. And in fact, the kind of flooding that this offered up needed to be understood also in the kind of challenge of the infrastructure that surrounded this. Now, as cities grow, and Toronto's growing like many, what used to be at the edge now becomes an opportunity to rethink a center, and a center that might actually submit to more natural forces, relax those armatures, and actually open, say, in the case of the recreational fields here, the potential for soft infrastructure of flooding and recreation. In fact, it takes a lot of work, collaboration, and humbling obligations because nature's not so kind, and working with geotechnical engineers, waterfront engineers, softening is harder than you would think. But we actually get very excited about this idea of the coincidence of the hard and the soft, with infrastructure here and a new infrastructure, say, of wetlands and softlands and passages that might actually make their way to a new kind of setting, a sort of inhabitable infrastructure that becomes urbane in its identity. Now, there's another tactical question then. If you look at urban renewal, it has a legacy in St. Louis that is shockingly sublime. A beautiful 93-acre park supporting the St. Louis Arch by Saarinen, completely cut off at the knees the instant it was born by the highways that surrounded and separated it from the city and, by the way, the water's edge. So when we were considering the potential of actually the arch, the city, the river, the question for us was, how do we actually look at the barriers that were surrounding this entire area, keeping it from being connected from the city, and actually thinking a lot further about how it actually might reach across the river and center the river as the center of two urban identities, St. Louis and East St. Louis, in one kind of continuous but completely differentiated journey around. Now, that raises a question. Water's edges are elusive things, whether they've been thrown off by infrastructure in Toronto or in this case by flooding or 1,200 parking spaces. One could say that a water's edge has lost its identity if it can't be regained for the people. So for us, we love the question of what happens when there's a 26-foot water change level. What can you do to still make the water's edge inhabitable? So the idea of an urban bluff, if you can look at this slide when the water level is low, and then a water's edge that could still be inhabited when the water level is high, you can see that that bluff might actually introduce a new potential for urban life. But on the other side of the river, where land was inexpensive, contaminated, and uninterested in many people, the other models, if you will, the wildness of the Mississippi and the Cahokia Indians wise enough to build a city, one of the first American cities, high up and with these artificial topographies, that idea of an artificial topography and natural systems coming together inspired us to think about a new paradigm for another city, a kind of wild natural setting, but one not so far from an extraordinary icon. So we actually got a chance to test out what it is to realize something like this in Seattle when the Olympic Sculpture Park held a competition, and they acquired two pieces of property separated by a highway, and the city owned one piece of property separated by the train lines. Now, the museum said they wanted to create a sculpture park free and open to the public, but the question of how do you actually support all these connections, keep highways moving, trains moving, and indeed maybe even support a kind of aquatic life, didn't seem as simple as this, but we tried to think of it as simple, something that might unfold on an infrastructural level and superimpose one more layer of urban structure, in this case an infrastructure of art and landscape, to unfold and connect the city, and be a chameleon that goes from the city to the water's edge. But it's all about a series of layers that need to be considered tactically and statistically so that those metrics can still be simultaneously considered along a 6-year period of time, and this is a neat graph of all the players that had to weigh in and have memorandums of understanding and agreement, not to mention cost estimates argued for, to be able to create an earthwork that could straddle the site, be metrically supported by concrete, be unfolded as an urban identity at the city's edge, be stratified and inhabited, be pointedly clear about where it crossed the highway, be vividly clear when you drove through it, be straddling 110 feet of train lines, be slipping across the water's edge to make it to a crumbling seawall that needed to be reinforced, to then open up finally to a beach that actually got $2.5 million of federal funding to create salmon habitat. So in fact, what becomes questionable to us is that its simultaneous challenges are not so much one challenge of urbanism, but maybe it's less about a consolidated ideal, but maybe an ideal of being instrumental in a project, and think about an urbanism that might intensify social, cultural forces, and maybe even define a new reciprocity between urbanism, landscape, and architecture. Thank you.
Okay, hard acts to follow. And not to mention the red card, which is always a little unsettling. I'm happy to be able to wrap up this panel, and I will try not to keep you from dinner too much, but I'm sure Alex will keep us on time. Thank you. Most urban design education is focused on the creation of tidy urbanism, a design practice that attempts to shape or direct human behavior, usually toward the elusive and vague aim of building community. This image of Millennium Park offers a great example of what this practice aims to produce. It is impressive, but nevertheless incomplete, though, without the people in it. Cities and urban places are enlivened by people, yet we, those being the urban designers that are architects first, usually clear out the people to take our pictures. Design of all types, however, whether new or old, traditional or modern, reflects a set of values and norms. Let's remember, for instance, that Surt's plan for Havana would have leveled Habana Vieja's messy mix of uses and architectural styles in favor of a tidier arrangement of blocks, courtyard buildings, and modern towers. However, in a human society that is increasingly global, fluid, and diverse, we must address and support multiple urbanisms and identities. I suggest that our challenge is to address, accommodate, and embrace messy urbanism. The kinds of places that typically are shaped out of resistance to the status quo, with limited resources, and usually by some rogue individual, often an artist, creating tension among neighbors and frustration for local officials. Examples of this type of place or experience are shown here in the Heidelberg Project in Detroit, that continues to evolve in the vacant and vacated spaces of urban Detroit. St. Elmo Village in Los Angeles, which was first established after the Watts riots in 1967 and was further expanded after the civil unrest of 1992, and continues to house and provide shelter and galleries and arts education for artists and neighbors and local school children. Watts Towers in Los Angeles, we all remember this one, almost was leveled by the city's bulldozers till finally preservationists rallied to the cause and were able to save it. And today, it is surrounded by a park and is accompanied by 2 additional cultural buildings and is is a cultural landmark and a tourist destination, as is the Heidelberg Project. These kinds of messy places are all over the US and all over the world, in fact. But many of them have been threatened by legal and cultural enforcement because they misbehave. They are not tidy. For instance, the work of Shepard Fairey, shown here, accompanying the exhibit of his work at the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, includes about a dozen murals posted all over the city, but carefully orchestrated to get proper permissions and avoid those kinds of tensions and conflicts. Nevertheless, the mural shown on the left was painted the day after it was installed, after the owner, who had given his permission for the mural, received complaints from parents of the children in the school across the street. Paint the Street was a project pulled off by ArtsWave in Cincinnati just about less than 2 months ago, taking over a half a mile of 12th Street and over the Rhine, and in one day, painting these great graphics all up and down the street. This, too, was carefully orchestrated to avoid potential confrontation. City Council had to establish or approve a non-withstanding ordinance to allow this to happen. And even after all of the coordination with police, transportation, and public works and the utility companies, they still were not allowed to touch the sidewalk because in January of this year, the city council had passed an ordinance pretty much prohibiting any modification of sidewalks, either temporary or permanent. But this was pulled off, a half a mile of 12th Street in one day, involving the work of 5 artists and over 1,500 volunteer painters. I love, this was the last piece to finish. These, the quotes and some of the images in the artwork were inspired by a community workshop where we asked the question, what do you think about this city? What do you think about this neighborhood? And this was one of the concepts that someone presented, that Cincinnati was really a city of choice. And I think the last piece is a video, if Doug can, yeah. But wait, maybe hold it, or did you get it to go?
Starting.
Do we have sound? Urbanism and urban design are ever-evolving processes. We cannot and should not pretend to master plan, but strategically set the stage for other actors that are largely unknown to us and who will enrich, modify, and improve the spaces we design in ways that we cannot and should not predict. Let us find ways to be accountable to multiple publics and advocates for multiple urbanisms and identities, to contribute to a rich and diverse public realm, to deregulate public space, and be generous through design of constraint. Thank you.
Ask the panel to come up. Well, first let me say, don't worry about dinner, Michael. It's still about an hour and a half away, so we have plenty of time.
Right.
Secondly, the red sheet that Michael referred to is this thing, which of course, predictably, all the panelists ignored. But that's okay, for very good reason. Let me notice how in the first panel, when we talk about the past, there's a kind of a bit of a sanitization that takes place. And there's kind of a sort of polite, almost kind of a transition from the 60s to the present, and some bits of disagreement, but a kind of a continuous narrative of evolution. But when we get to the present, of course, we've just heard some 5 rather remarkably different perceptions about kind of where the kind of the agency of urban design might at least, not in totality be, but at least be paying attention to. And I'm about to say something probably a little bit, I'm about to do something I think a little bit stupid, just to kind of to parody each of these presentations before asking you to kind of respond to them. In effect, I believe it proves my point that urban design is a product of, through a certain amount of sensitivities to to a lot of variables. That's, in a sense, I think we've just heard. So Charles, of course, talked about kind of needing to heed the lessons and history of landscape architecture, because indeed that is the profession that has had, I think, the greatest proximity to issues about land, resources, ecology, settlement patterns, dating back all the way to the beginning of the middle of the 19th century at the very least. And so the kind of pull of landscape onto urban design was very clear and hardly arguable. Susan, of course, made us realize that the pull from planning is essential for urban design. Indeed, we don't often talk about, as we design things, issues of equity or justice. We should. We're not quite sure how to actually incorporate that into a drawing, perhaps, or a planning diagram. We know instinctively it's very important, but planners, of course, think about this, or should think about this on a daily basis. So Susan reinforced the idea that the pull from planning onto urban design is very dramatic and very essential. And Rudolpho reminded us, of course, that the primary parent of urban design, at least as was sort of conceived of in this country, in this building, actually it preceded this building, but in this institution, was the parenting of architecture. And then, of course, maybe expressed how maybe this particular parent is teaching us some wrong lessons in this particular moment in time as the challenges on urbanism grow. And then Marion, if I may say, made us remind ourselves of somebody who has not yet been an actor not yet identified previously to her comment and her work, which is the civil engineer. Civil engineers think about infrastructure. They build it, they plan it, they execute it. They often do it seemingly to all of us in this room, oblivious to many of the issues that we as urbanists value, perhaps even many that citizens value. So I think a message from me, from Marion, is that one should kind of heed, conquer, work with, but transform the objectives of the traditional civil engineer, who still has much control over our environment, and add many dimensions of urbanism and design to that work. And of course, Michael, I'll particularly apologize for this simplification. Michael reminded us that actually citizenry is critical to urban design. Citizenry. And that actually, since Susan said that Jane Jacobs' name hadn't been mentioned yet, she attended the 56th conference. This was 3 or 4 years before her book came out. Some even suspect that the conference made her think more about this book, in contrast to what she'd heard. And perhaps the most memorable line that she made at the conference, at least again for me, was she said, remember, and actually she said something like, remember you guys, because it was mostly guys there, remember that a store is also a storekeeper. That's a very, I think, profound expression of the Jane Jacobs philosophy. We think about things like stores or highways or parks, but behind them, of course, as Michael reminded us, are also storekeepers or people. For me, I think the amazing thing about these 5 presentations was not that they agreed, they actually disagreed, but that they reinforced that the pull on urban design must come from all of these disciplines, and that ultimately it's both sort of its burden and its value. And I don't know whether anyone wants to argue with any of those points. I'd urge you to do so. Otherwise, because dinner is upon us in about an hour or so, I would turn to the floor to engage you all as well. But it's the same people. You know, there's another 200 people in the room, so you've had your chance. Okay, and then I guess Roger, my old classmate back there, yes.
Well, I may regret saying this, but I...
It better not be about master planning.
I'm looking at this panel here, and today we've talked about landscape, architecture, infrastructure, planning, etc. And I used to work for EDA under Joe Brown.
Stand up again for the... Right.
I used to work for EDA under Joe Brown, and we got acquired a few years back by AECOM. Now, AECOM is a compilation, as some of you may or may not know, of now about 60,000 people. And it has, at the top is predominantly known as an engineering company. But we are practicing in Asia with a huge, about 100 urban designers, about 20% of which or more actually come from the GSD, actually out of the MAUD or MARC programs. I'm curious as to your perceptions of what you're thinking is about these types of mega corporations who are acquiring different parts and components of urban design and master planning and construction, et cetera, and what you feel, what your thoughts are on this type of trend in development.
You want us to critique AECOM, do you? Anyone on the panel, please?
Well, I have one comment, which is I think the reason we're seeing the same mega project here, there, and everywhere is in many ways caused by these global companies which bring their particular boilerplate, so that there may be differences from the different companies, but the fact that these same firms do the same thing in so many different places leads to a certain kind of global homogenization.
Rodolfo, you're nodding your head. Can I?
Yeah, no, I simply agree with that. Yes, I think it's probably one of the reasons why those things look as bad as they do.
Sometimes they can look good, but they're still very similar.
You're not involved in a global corporation. What do you say to that?
Well, being very uncorporate but nascently global, one of the things that we've observed with some of the very, very large outfits that are being entrusted to develop master plans for cities that might be invented in a million in about 3 years is that the temptation to move very, very quickly is quite high. And similarly, then, the temptation to believe whatever is projected is very, very high. And I always have this funny feeling, like the Wizard of Oz, where you pull the curtain back, that you realize, well, there's 60,000 people there. There's only 7 of those guys working on it. Maybe 25% of them are GSD graduates. So in some ways, this question about who is at the table when the master plan is done by the very, very large firms is a question that I think needs to be asked each and every time.
Well, actually, we're going to go there first, but let me say something, if I may. If one is not cynical about these large firms, one says they actually are trying to do what we're all suggesting. They're trying to bring together architects and landscape architects and planners and engineers and civil engineers and economists and somehow collaborate, right? If you want to give them some aspiration, that's what they're trying to do. I think the thing that's missing actually is a kind of a core belief in a certain set of values about what it is that they're trying to get at. For me, that's a kind of an urban design perspective, or an urbanism perspective. So I would distinguish, of course, the desire to collaborate, which these firms have, from an occasional absence internal to them, a kind of a core set of beliefs about, in fact, what urbanism ought to be. And that's the way I would kind of challenge you as a member of one of these large corporations.
You know, the longer we go in this answer, the more uncomfortable I'm getting, and I may regret this, but I suppose one could also say that the scale and pace at which capital flows globally these days in the development of urban form, while it has its impact on the shape of firms and their structure and organization and their scale, of course also has its roots in a particular form of capital formation, a particular form of neoliberal economy in which practices continually change in response. And obviously, I mean, we feel as though we need to occupy a position of leadership here. Having said that, my own opinion is that, in fact, practice responds much more quickly to social, environmental, and cultural changes, not to mention economic ones. Mm-hmm. And if you look at that history of practice, you know, in this building, we often get hung up on a kind of beating up of the large corporate practice, so-called, and I understand where that comes from historically. But I think, in fact, if you look at models of practice, we historically have modeled ourselves often 25 years ago around professional identity. You would have seen practices that defined themselves as landscape architects or urban designers or planners or architects. And over the course of the last 2 decades or more, many people, Brown included, have argued that, in fact, practice has moved into a transitional state at which it looked to integrate those professions. There was a kind of a moment when professions or kind of organizations tried to emulate the integration. And now, increasingly, I think corporate entities and other firms would describe themselves as related to mirroring their corporate clients. That is, they're responding to and reflecting the kind of change of scale and capitalization of projects that are out there. And so there's an interesting moment here, I think, where the challenges that we're responding to or addressing produce their own formations of design professional that I think we're yet to see.
So back there, Roger, and then Andreas, and then Uwe, and then you, sir, those next four. Okay.
I'd like to try to find a segue from what Professor Feinstein was talking about, the need for thinking about equity, and perhaps what we're just talking about here with globalism. And I would encourage everybody in this room to look around our wonderful city where we grew up here. And we're an amazing classroom, really, or test for so many of these issues. When Alex and I were students in 75 to 77, we had rent control. The city was a place where no one wanted to invest. We had high unemployment, very low bond ratings. And now we have recently had Novartis drop out of the sky and Sanofi Aventis wanting to come here. What happened? Well, we were able to have urban design plans that unfolded, fortunately, following the vagaries of the economy, to a point now where we really are quite successful, but what do we do about that equity question? Because as we've done all that, our housing prices have gone through the roof. So you just look around here and think about the changes since you were students here. And a lot of it, I think, is very good. I do think we can try to deal with equity, and I think one of the things we have in Cambridge that I'm very proud of is we have a 15% affordable requirement for any housing project over 12 units. So we've produced several hundred units of affordable housing that are indistinguishable from the market rate units. That's just a requirement. And I'm just wondering, I don't know. I mean, do other communities have this kind of requirement? To me, that's one of the main ways to get at some kind of equity. Fortunately, we've had enough economic success that we've been able to put $30 million of city tax money into creating these affordable units. So not every place can do that because they haven't been so fortunate to be a hub of an international health sciences kind of system. So do panelists know whether other communities are dealing with that equity question in other ways?
I'll turn to Susan in a second. I had asked the panelists earlier to be concisely provocative. I would ask the audience to also be concisely provocative, please. We'd like to get as many issues out as much as we can. And by the way, longer statements about your points of view, any of you will be available. We'll have a whole hour and a half tomorrow where there's an open mic situation and you can make statements.
Sorry, I was too long, Alex.
For now, if you just ask a question of the panelists. So go ahead, Susan, if you want to address Roger's point. Then
40B, which actually prevailed on the ballot, somewhat to my surprise, in November or at the beginning of this month, does require communities in Massachusetts, if they're having large housing developments, to provide affordable housing. New Jersey has a fair housing law, but most states don't. But certainly inclusionary zoning and linkage policies towards housing are one way that you can require equity. The United Kingdom had a much higher requirement for affordable housing in connection with any housing project. However, the current Tory government is, I would guess, probably going to eliminate that requirement. In Amsterdam, more than 50% of the housing is, in fact, social housing. So we see, even under capitalism, a great deal of variation in terms of the way in which planning and design together do or don't produce equitable environments.
So Andreas, could I just ask Uwe first, and then turn to you, Andreas, and then the gentleman right there. Yeah, right, yeah.
I just wanted to make an observation that when we talk about the kind of corporatization of the delivery mechanism itself, we are skipping over a very fundamental issue that we've not been explicit about, which is the role of urban design as economic planning in cities. And that is the mechanism whereby the equity issues and other injustices within cities will be addressed. And I think it's on a kind of moving forward perspective, what is so unique right now is that the urban design process itself is recognized not only as a reaction to the economic forces, but actually a shaper of the type of economies within cities. And whether we kind of easily discuss this as creative class issues, it's kind of one portal into that. But there's a much deeper issue behind the public policy reasons for engaging urban design, and that is the shaping of the urban economy.
Andreas, then, unless somebody wants to comment on what you said, yes.
You asked for concise provocation. Going back to the ACOM and your critique of it, you said the problem with the large firms is that they do not have core beliefs and set of values. Does Harvard and urban design have a core belief and set of values, or do I believe that I've heard you correctly and it does not have core belief and set of values? In fact, quite the opposite.
Well,
That's a question.
of course,
And what are the core beliefs and set of values of Harvard?
you're addressing it to me directly, or
no,
I'm just
to-
the moderator here?
The chairman should answer.
I actually, but in fact, I think that there are very substantial core beliefs. Partially, it's to stay as unideological as possible. Partially, it's kind of not to reduce notions of urbanism to some kind of formulaic response, regardless of context. Partially, it's to kind of treat different scales and cultural problems differently, with specific methods appropriate to the extent that we can determine them. So those at least are three very specific, very ingrained cultural values that we have in the urban design program. In fact, throughout the GSD, I would say and hope.
Okay, but that could be confused by somebody like me who's at a distance for an absence of core belief and set of values.
Yeah, I understand.
Okay, well, I'm glad you've clarified it. Thank you.
Yes, sir, over there, right.
Thanks. My name is Paul Vagione. I graduated from the MDes in '99. I just completed a 3-year term as Secretary General of the International Society of City and Regional Planners. This is a planning association with presence in over 70 countries, headquartered in The Hague. And I am now advising the 100 Cities Initiative from United Nations Habitat, United Nations being the UN agency concerned with the urban settlements. From the field and with the pragmatic hat on, I can say that we are seeing an emerging need of an urban professional that has a systemic view of a city and also has an eye on design. This would support the moderator's view expressed on the previous panel, that there's a need for an urban planner/designer, a professional that understands legislation and execution, the know-how and the how-to. Which leads me to make one reflection, if you allow me. When we speak about urban design, could there be merit in decoupling design and the production of form? You see, form is not necessarily the only outcome of design. Urban professionals might apply design thinking when producing policy instruments, participatory processes, supramunicipal cooperation, coordinated sector investment, and of course, the shape of buildings and the fabric that they create. This is the challenge for urban professionals. How to do all of this, or how to identify who can do this and when can do this in an integrated and coordinated manner.
Thank you. You've just heard 5 remarkable presentations, limited to their 5 minutes or more. Please engage these 5 individuals. So yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm
Could
Greg.
you stand up and
Well, I don't like to put my back to all these people. But
say your
anyway.
name? It's always nice, and I'm sorry I didn't ask you for yours. Right?
Greg Baldwin. I'd like to ask a question about how you would convey advice to a younger generation. I'm I'm at the stage where I wouldn't say that what I gained almost 50 years ago at GSD and in urban design has waned, but I think there are changes. When I came, there was a prerequisite, or what I understood was a prerequisite, that basically you had to have a Catholic appetite for community. You had to have a Quakerly sense of responsibility for society, and you can have the values you were describing. I think that's probably still relevant. Originally, those were assigned to 3 disciplines, and you've described the need to share the wealth, and I think it was anticipated then. We haven't done very well at getting there. But there also were some tasks that were identified as being things, challenges that we might pursue, specific tasks, not just general professional challenges. You mentioned that Lewis Mumford, or earlier was mentioned that Lewis Mumford talked about dealing with the car in the community. Well, we understand now how to get people out of their cars and into transit and on sidewalks. And if we don't, it's just that we've chosen not to. It's not that we don't understand how to do it successfully. CERT talked about how to strengthen the centers of our cities for all people in all activities. And I think we understand how to do it. I mean, we haven't done it, but we do understand how to get there. Maki talked about the value of infrastructure. And again, I think we've learned a lot about that. I think when I talk to younger people that the challenges that are before them are different. And I'm not sure exactly what they are. Part of the responsibility is for them to figure it out. Part of the responsibility, I think, is the institutions from whence they come to help them figure it out. What might they be?
So what would each of you say in response to how you would address younger people, which of course we do
Every day.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's a question we've spent, I think, quite a lot of time on in the 14, 15 months that I've been in the building. I mean, some members of our caucus have described it as a kind of upward pressure from our incoming candidates who demand social and environmental relevance. And that has a kind of leavening effect on these conversations, I think, often. It impacts pedagogy in really quite interesting ways. At the same moment, many of our graduates, leave school to change where they are on the globe and go into forms of practice that we can barely recognize. And my own sense personally as an educator is we could sit around and talk about what they're going to be working on in 25 years, and if we were to model it, we'd most likely get it wrong, historically speaking. And so we talk a lot about what's durable, what are the values and what are the skill sets and what are the sensibilities that our graduates need. Post-68, it's pretty clear that most of the disciplines in this building were on a kind of external trajectory of their own autonomy. In my own field, landscape architecture, we tended to be radicalized around environmental advocacy. Planners were radicalized around the autonomy of their kind of advocacy around social issues. And architecture enjoyed its own kind of autonomy relative to its own cultural forms. And I think the moment today, certainly in this building, is one of a kind of convergence that we agree that we share more than we have in many, many decades. And at the same moment, the challenges that our students will be addressing transcend those easily defined disciplinary boundaries. And so in that regard, for our students, certainly, I would think that the ability to use design across a range of scales and a range of challenges, leavened by the social and environmental, would be a way of getting at that.
Well, I think I want to echo certainly what Charles had to say, in particular to alert students to being sensitive to social issues. But I actually don't see myself as an advisor telling students what they ought to do, but rather that really what you want to do is encourage them to engage in dialogue and interchange and to raise questions all the time. And I hope maybe one can prod people into seeing questions that they hadn't seen before. But I don't think one can lay down what it is as kind of advice from Ann Landers or somebody in terms of what they should be doing in the future.
But Charles, I think, as I heard Charles, and I agree, I think what I heard, I think I agree with, they're sensitizing us, the younger generation, to some extent, sensitizing us to some of these social issues.
And among the challenges, I think, is for us to continually kind of refine the pedagogic conversation relative to both our incoming candidates, but equally the challenges that they go to face in practice.
I think that one should not have a pedagogy treated as if it were a market product. They want this, so I'll give them this. I think that's too risky and perhaps ethically iffy in academia. I think that after all, there is a knowledge that needs to be transmitted, even if they don't like it. Because we believe that that knowledge is necessary for the full exercising of their professional lives. It's not just about experimentation. Experimentation is something that you can achieve after you have received something that allows you to experiment. To begin with, experimentation seems to me a failure of pedagogy, in as much as it would be, for instance, to offer a course in this because they want that. I mean, it's not this kind of system. We have something to say about what we do and have received from others. Some of us that were lucky to have good teachers.
Michael, you certainly have done a lot of teaching of young people
Right?
at various ages. So what do you teach them?
Well, I was just thinking about the fact that my goal has always been to get students to think beyond what the boundaries of our discipline have traditionally been, and that actually makes it pretty complicated for the students, I think, to take in all that information. And so I have a sense that maybe we may be moving maybe more toward the Harvard model, where students will come to architecture education or urban design education with backgrounds in a bunch of other disciplines or the liberal arts or something, because they're getting exposed to these larger issues and values that we can't pretend to deliver in our discipline, in our professional training. But that said, the great thing, I mean, you guys all saw the Paint the Street project, and I thought it was about time to bring the fun back to the GSD and to today in urban design, but it just was coincidental that event was right at the beginning of our fall quarter. And in fact, because I was at a conference, I'd missed the first day of class for my 132 freshmen. So I actually made it required for them to come to that event and participate. And over 100 of them were able to, and I was just reading over their journal entries about what they remembered, what their kind of reflection back on it. And it was just amazing because the students at the University of Cincinnati are consistently, almost irretractably, middle-class, suburban, white kids who are afraid of over the Rhine. That all they know is they're supposed to be afraid because murders happen there and all kinds of stuff. And they were pretty anxious. And, I sent out the email that they had to go to this, and they were like, are you providing transportation? Are you providing security or whatever? It's like you could roll down the hill from school to this place. Somebody took a taxi. I mean, it was pretty incredible. But they pretty much came up to me afterwards and in their reflections have said, I was really afraid, but this was just an amazing opportunity. I saw how incredible the core of Cincinnati is. All of these people, all these very different people and different ages and backgrounds, all working on the same thing at the same time. Now, that said, I'm not trying to promote them being street painters. But that sensibility, the awareness, the exposure, and the new comfort that they have with those places, I think will make them more, I hope, more sensitive designers in the future.
Great. Marion, do you want to add something to this?
I mean, it's a great question. I mean, what are the kinds of ambitions, or what is the dream when somebody comes to school to want to do architecture or urban design? And it seems that the question is about a level of fullness, and each discipline in some ways has to be very, very strong so that its identity can allow a student to feel full of those knowledge cores, but then that fullness needs to sort of cross over to become transdisciplinary in a way. But it's really, I think, a point about asking them to dream, to ask questions, to engage, and to fail faster and faster if they can.
Great question. Greg, you got all 5 responses, so let's keep that alive. Sir?
let me follow that theme for a while. If I were asked to advise the younger generation what to do, I would suggest for them to diversify. Maybe even get into decision-making roles such as in politics, be mayors, be city managers, things where they can make a true influence instead of being told what to do by the politicians. So for the younger generation, go into politics and make that decision. By the same token, first of all, I want to thank the school for putting this together. From the previous panel and this panel, the challenges is how to make urban design, urban planning more impactful. Perhaps instead of just, in addition to just teaching ourselves the importance of urban design, perhaps it may be possible, and I'd like the panel to give me some suggestions as to how you can individually and collectively go to the different disciplines, go to business schools, law school, school of government, and teach the importance of urban planning, urban design. Because for us in the design school, we learn about urban economics, we learn about real estate development, but none of the other disciplines, none of the other schools learn much about planning or design. And consequently, when they make decisions like that, it's only simply based on the bottom line. So.
Anyone? I mean, it seems like an interesting question to ask. We're talking about interdisciplinarity, but sort of always one way towards our education. What about the education of others? Susan?
Well, perhaps we should say something about the importance of having a presence in the college, at the college level, which I know there are some conversations, I believe, in that direction. I think that would be very, very important to develop an awareness of the importance of design, its history, so on and so forth. But I'm not the person to talk about those plans. So.
Well, I agree with you, and I think it's really too bad at Harvard that it's so difficult to create a major in urban studies or urban design, and that other universities seem to be able to do this, but here it's very hard.
It's actually one of the great tragedies of Harvard College that it seems to be resisting urbanism as a topic of discourse. Yeah.
I mean, I'm the most recent person to join this party, but I can say in the 15 months I've been here, I've seen a number of indications, but also kind of historic track records. The PhD program that was joined with the Faculty of Arts and Sciences is extraordinarily well respected. We have amongst our faculty our own Alex Krieger, who teaches regularly in the college, as does Richard Foreman and John Stilgo from the landscape side. We also are in conversations presently about an architecture major in the college. And so I don't want to overstate those accomplishments yet, but what I would say is that the project of being more of a university and just fewer individual schools and more school and fewer individual departments is a real thing in my experience here. And one of its impacts also, of course, has been to connect the identity of the design school to a kind of wider literacy about design culture. I think you cannot underestimate today, both for our incoming candidates, but also in the wider conversation, how ambient design culture, both the status of the architect, but equally the role of cities, are in popular culture more generally.
This side of the room seems to be too tired to raise their hands, so Mr. Rothman and then Larry Bluestone.
Elliot Rothman, related to Marion's brilliant presentation of urban design solutions, what disciplines, what power structure are you working with to make them a reality? Because they all should happen.
That's a very generous observation that you just made about the presentations, and you'll see that only one of those was fully realized at the end, because in many cases, this question about how do these complex projects get realized does get down to the question of how do you operate in the public realm. And the one that was realized was led by a private group, the Seattle Art Museum, and they were able to be quite persuasive, but autonomous and independent as they engaged the public realm. So these are, I think, profound questions to realize. A larger question is how does it actually get framed up at the other side?
So we have a couple more minutes, maybe two more questions. Somebody from upstairs, possibly Mr. Bluestone. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Larry Bluestone. I am a graduate back from 1975. A question. I think that we all, as urbanists in one profession or another, aspire to do good. One of the formative events in my life is 3 days before I graduated architectural school, I stood in 1972 in St. Louis and watched Pruitt-Igoe be demolished. Of course, when it was built, it was seen as a model for how to do things. So if 25 years from today, we returned and had a conference, what potential for harm are we now headed for in our own directions that we see happening around us today as urbanists?
Not the question to end the panel on, but any responses to that?
This is not going to answer your question, of course, but the the kind of the mythical moment of the death of modern architecture as framed by Jenks haunts us to this day. And at the same moment, for all the ink that it's gotten, Hilb's project for Lafayette Park in Detroit, arguably the most successful project of post-war urban renewal in North America, public housing, socially, a mixed race, mixed class community, vibrant, ecologically diverse and sustainable, has gotten little press at all. And it speaks to the success of the postmodern project. I mean, Jenks and Baird and others were extraordinarily successful in essentially tarring the project of modern planning and architecture for what ultimately were equally social and political failures. I mean, the literature on public housing in Chicago and St. Louis is very clear that at the moment that the working poor, the working middle class were no longer allowed to live there, they imploded upon themselves. And so I think in part we're responsible in this building because we've internalized a narrative in which architecture and urbanism writ large was made culpable for a set of social and political failures.
If there's no pressing, oh yes, okay, last question right up there, one of our students at last.
Not a student, actually.
Actually, I was pointing above you, but that's okay.
That's very interesting.
So go ahead.
One of my students.
But quickly, okay.
I just wanted to add something to the earlier point. I think that, and perhaps go back to some of Rodolfo's points made earlier, I teach urban design at Carnegie Mellon University in a Bachelor of Architecture program, a 5-year traditional degree. And the way I approach it, much like the way Rodolfo approaches it at Machado and Savetti, where I used to work, is to talk to the architecture students about how I'm trying to inform them in terms of becoming better architects and to look at the site beyond the site. And I think Rodolfo's earlier comments about the two fundamental things about urban design, about looking at typology as a process and looking at culture are perhaps the two best things we can do to avoid the mistakes of Pruitt-Igoe and this exportation that we now face in emerging cities of these kinds of approaches to urban design.
So
Yeah, I'm
why don't you
sympathetic to the students.
let your student have the last word for the evening before we...
Well, I don't know if it can be the last word because it was a question for the panel. But I think the panel, this panel in particular, was very good at showing the multiplicity of challenges based on who you ask, what the challenges are for urban designers. And I guess I would ask, does there need to be a distinct role for the urban designer going forth? Or, and if so, what would need to be the distinct role of the urban designer versus an architect or a landscape architect in practice?
If I may, since we're at 6:30, why don't we save that question for the second day?
Oh, no.
Please all, did you want to answer?
Remember, I was that student years ago. I want you to get an answer.
Well, go ahead. Be my guest.
Oh.
Well,
I would say there's no one role.
Yes.
And that is the most important message, is that that no one person and no one discipline can respond to the complex issues and challenges that we face today, not to mention what we'll face tomorrow. So the great thing about not having a singular ideology is that each of us has the ability to carve out a sector of this discipline or these practices for ourselves. And each time we engage a project or a place, we have the opportunity to brush up against, collide, and collaborate with different other professionals from different perspectives, as well as the communities in which we'll be working.
Thank you. And let's thank the panel, remarkably brilliant, diverse. and yet complimentary as well. So I think another round of applause. Right.